363 AD, Ethiopia. Something happened that most Christians have never been told. A group of bishops gathered behind closed doors, not to translate scripture, not to preserve it, but to decide what you would never be allowed to read, not because it was fake, not because it was lost, because it was too much, too overwhelming, too direct, too dangerous for ordinary people to encounter without control. And what they removed was a version of Jesus so powerful, so cosmic, that once you see it, the version you grew up with starts to feel incomplete. Before we go further, if you've ever felt like there's something missing in what you've been taught, subscribe right now, because videos like this don't get pushed forever, and the moment they stop recommending this, you won't find it again. If you decide not to subscribe, go to the comments and explain why you'd rather stay comfortable than know the full picture. They met in a city called Laodicea. No cameras, no public records explaining the full reasoning. Just a list of texts. Texts that early Christians had already been reading for generations. These weren't fringe writings. These were circulating alongside the Gospels, studied, quoted, trusted. But inside those texts, Jesus wasn't just a teacher. He wasn't just a healer. He wasn't even just a savior. He was described as something far more unsettling, a being whose presence bent reality itself, a figure whose authority didn't stop at earth, but extended across realms most people have never even heard described. And the bishops knew something. If ordinary people started reading this version, they wouldn't just question theology, they would question control. So they voted. And with that vote, those books were removed. Copies didn't just disappear, they were hunted, burned, destroyed, not slowly, not accidentally, but deliberately. Because what those texts described couldn't be easily managed inside an institution. They described a Jesus who didn't require permission to access, a Jesus who didn't need mediation, a Jesus who didn't belong to a system. And over time, that version faded from the Western world, not completely erased, but reduced to fragments, echoes, traces inside the few texts that remained. But something unexpected happened. Far from Rome, far from Europe, far from every council and decree in the mountains of Ethiopia, they kept copying. They copied through war, through invasion, through isolation that lasted centuries. They didn't know anything had been removed. They didn't know anything had been banned. They simply believed, this is scripture. So they preserved it, line by line, generation after generation, for over 1,500 years. And let me ask you something. If something was preserved for 1,500 years, while the rest of the world erased it, would you ignore it? Or would you at least want to know what's inside it? Because what they preserved was not the version most people recognize today. Not the soft, distant figure in paintings, not the calm, predictable image people are comfortable with, but a presence described like this: a face brighter than 1,000 suns, a voice that commands angels and terrifies demons, a being whose existence doesn't operate inside time, but moves through it, a figure so overwhelming that even heavenly beings respond with submission. This wasn't symbolic language. This was how early believers understood him. And this is where it becomes impossible to ignore, because one of the few people in modern Hollywood who has actually explored this is Mel Gibson. When he made The Passion of the Christ in 2004, people thought that was the full story. It wasn't. He said it himself. That film ended at the tomb. But what happens after that has never been fully shown. And when he described the sequel, he didn't describe something simple. He described multiple realms, non-linear reality movement beyond time, a descent and ascent across dimensions. Most people assumed he was exaggerating. He wasn't. He was describing something that already existed inside the Ethiopian texts. And listen carefully. If this video disappears from your feed tomorrow, you'll forget you ever saw it. That's how the algorithm works. So don't wait. Subscribe now, or accept that you might never see content like this again. Mel Gibson made The Passion of the Christ in 2004, and the world thought it was over. A brutal crucifixion, a sealed tomb, a final breath, credits. But Gibson never treated it like the full story. He treated it like the doorway. Because once the stone is rolled away, the story stops behaving like history and starts behaving like something far stranger. Not stranger in the sense of fantasy. Stranger in the sense that the world you thought you were living in suddenly feels too small to contain what happened next. That is where the Ethiopian Bible becomes impossible to ignore, because for most Christians in the West, the resurrection is told in a sequence. The women go to the tomb. The stone is moved. The body is gone. Jesus appears. He speaks. He rises. But the Ethiopian tradition preserves a deeper architecture beneath that story. It does not treat the resurrection as a single event inside a single city. It treats it as a rupture that echoed through every layer of creation. And once you hear that version, you stop asking why Gibson said the sequel had to move through realms. You start asking why the version most people know was ever reduced to something so small. Because what if the cross was not only seen from earth? What if it was watched from above? What if angels were not distant observers but witnesses standing at the edge of a cosmic moment so immense that even they could not fully grasp what God was doing until it was already underway? That is the world these texts open. And it is not a quiet world. It is not a neat world. It is a world full of fire, hierarchies, thrones, watchers, gates, descent, concealment, glory, and a Christ so immense that even creation itself has to be shielded from his full presence. That is not the Jesus most people were taught to imagine. That is the Jesus Ethiopia never stopped preserving. And that changes the next part of the story completely. Most people begin the story of Jesus in Bethlehem, a manger, a census, a star, a child. The Ethiopian tradition forces you to begin much earlier, before the stable, before Mary, before Rome, before the shepherds even lifted their heads toward the sky, because in these ancient writings, Christ is not introduced as a new figure entering history for the first time. He is already there, already enthroned, already known in heaven, already terrifying in majesty, already carrying authority that predates the earth itself. That matters, because once Christ is understood as pre-existent in that way, the incarnation stops feeling like a sweet beginning. It becomes an almost unthinkable descent. Not a baby entering a hard world, but the highest reality entering the lowest condition. The beloved moving downward through layered heavens, veiling himself at each stage, reducing the visible expression of his glory so that created beings can survive the encounter. Think about that for a second. Not merely humility. Concealment on a scale the human mind can barely process. He is not becoming less than he is. He is hiding what he is, and he is doing it in stages. That is why the Ascension of Isaiah is so explosive when you read it carefully. It does not describe the movement of Christ toward earth as a simple travel scene. It describes a passing through levels of reality where at every stage, the beings of that realm perceive him according to what they are capable of bearing. He appears angelic among angels, radiant among the radiant, veiled among the veiled, not because heaven failed to recognize him completely, but because the full truth would have shattered the order of what had been created. And now think about what Gibson said. He said the sequel must begin before Bethlehem. He said it must start in another realm. He said it must show realities beyond the visible world. That is not random. That is not decorative theology. That is the blueprint these texts have been preserving for centuries. If the story begins before Bethlehem, then it cannot begin with peace. It has to begin with rebellion, because one of the deepest themes connecting Enoch, Isaiah, and the wider Ethiopian scriptural world is that Earth is not an isolated stage. It is contested ground. The visible world is being watched, influenced, distorted, moved upon by powers older than empires. That is why the Book of Enoch mattered so much to ancient readers. Not because it gave them entertainment, because it gave them context. It explained why the world feels disordered, why violence multiplies, why corruption spreads, why kingdoms rise with unnatural arrogance, why knowledge itself can become dangerous when severed from obedience to God. In Enoch, the rebellion of heavenly beings is not a side note. It is part of the fracture in creation, a breach, a contamination. And once you bring that into the story of Christ, the incarnation starts to look less like a gentle moral lesson and more like an invasion into territory that has already been damaged. That is why the arrival of Jesus is feared, not only celebrated, feared. The righteous wait for him. Heaven longs for him. But the rebellious powers understand that his appearance means the order they corrupted is about to be challenged at the root. Now the crucifixion looks different. Now the temptation in the wilderness looks different. Now the demons crying out in recognition look different. They are not merely reacting to a teacher from Galilee. They are reacting to someone they know from before. Someone concealed in flesh, someone whose humility does not lessen his authority, someone who has entered the broken world without announcing his full force, but who remains what he always was. That is one of the most unnerving ideas in all these texts. Christ arrives quietly, but heaven is not confused. Hell is not confused. Only people are confused, and that confusion becomes part of the drama. Because if you reveal him too openly, the whole story changes. The rulers of this world would react differently. The powers behind them would react differently. The timing would shift. So he moves through the world in concealment, while signs keep breaking through the veil. A storm obeys him. The sick recover at a word. The dead return. Spirits scream. Nature bends. And still most people only see a man. That is not weakness. That is restraint. And this is where a lot of people stop watching because the story gets heavier than they expected. So do this now. Subscribe before you forget. Because once the feed moves on, most people never come back and finish what they started. And if you don't subscribe, go to the comments and explain why you're comfortable hearing half the story when the deeper half is right in front of you. The Book of Enoch was dangerous for a very specific reason. Not just because it had visions, not just because it had angels, but because it gave ordinary people a frame for understanding reality that did not depend on an empire telling them what was permissible. It said history had a spiritual dimension. It said power could be corrupt in heavenly places before it ever became corrupt on earth. It said judgment was real. It said the Son of Man existed in glory before history finished unfolding. It said the righteous were not crazy for believing that the world they saw was not the whole world. That matters more than most people realize, because institutions can manage rituals, they can manage art, they can manage approved interpretations. What they cannot easily manage is a people convinced that heaven is larger, stranger, and more immediate than the official boundaries they were given. That kind of faith is difficult to centralize, and once Enoch starts sounding too much like the imagery of Revelation, the problem grows. Because then the question is no longer, why did this strange book disappear? The question becomes, why does the canonical book that remained still carry fingerprints from the one that was pushed away? Hair white as wool, eyes like fire, a face impossible to endure, judgment, thrones, books opened, cosmic court. These are not casual overlaps. They belong to the same imaginative world, the same deep stream, the same theological atmosphere, which means the Western Church did not remove something irrelevant. It removed something foundational. And Ethiopia kept reading it as though the break never happened. That should make you stop. Because for 1,500 years, entire communities of Christians were growing up with a scriptural imagination that connected Jesus not only to Bethlehem and Jerusalem, but to pre-creation glory, heavenly descent, angelic recognition, cosmic judgment, and the restoration of all things at every level of existence. That is not a small difference. That is a different scale of Christology altogether. The Western imagination tends to flatten heaven, one sky above, one invisible realm, one destination after death. The Ascension of Isaiah does not think that way. It describes layers, orders, degrees of glory, a reality that rises in intensity the higher one moves. The first heaven is not the last. The second is not the first. The third already strains language. By the sixth, a human mind begins to fail. The seventh belongs to the presence no created being can casually endure. That matters because, in that world, salvation is not a local event. It is vertical. It moves through layers. It concerns realms. The descent of Christ is not simply God appearing on earth. It is the highest entering the lowest by passing through everything in between. And the ascent is not simply departure. It is victory reasserting itself upward through the full structure of creation. Now the resurrection becomes larger than an empty tomb. It becomes the reversal of a cosmic descent, the reclothing of hidden glory, the announcement that death did not merely lose in one grave outside Jerusalem. It lost everywhere its power had spread. Think of how much bigger that is. Not one corpse revived, creation itself receiving the first shockwave of restoration. That is why a linear treatment begins to feel inadequate, because the event is not small enough to remain inside human sequencing. One realm witnesses one aspect, another witnesses another. Earth sees the absence of the body. Hell experiences invasion. Heaven experiences return. The disciples experience encounter. The powers of darkness experience exposure. All of it belongs to the same event. And that is what Gibson seems to be reaching toward when he says the resurrection cannot be told linearly. He is not abandoning Scripture. He may be moving closer to an older and wider scriptural imagination than most viewers have ever encountered. Walk into many churches in the West and Jesus is recognizable immediately. Light skin in many paintings, controlled softness, gentle eyes, measured sorrow. But in Ethiopian iconography, something different confronts you. Not a weaker Jesus, not a more aggressive Jesus, a more cosmic one. The eyes are deeper, the gaze is steadier. The gold surrounding him is not decoration, it is theology. It signals divine radiance, uncreated glory, a presence not contained by ordinary flesh even when fully human. He is near but not reduced, human but not domesticated, compassionate but not safe in the sentimental way modern people often want him to be. That matters because art teaches people what to imagine, and what people imagine shapes what they believe. If generation after generation is shown Christ only as soft, approachable, and emotionally soothing, then much of the biblical terror of divine holiness begins to disappear from the imagination. But the older texts do not let that happen. They speak of beauty, yes. They speak of mercy, yes. But they also speak of radiance so overwhelming that language starts to fail. They speak of beings falling in worship. They speak of thrones, flames, courts, unveiling, and glory that does not flatter the observer but unmakes them before rebuilding them. That is closer to what Ethiopia preserved, and it may be closer to what Gibson is trying to put back in front of audiences who have only ever seen one side. At this point, some people are realizing this is not the Jesus they were taught to picture. That's exactly why you need to stay to the end. Share this video now because you're not going to remember every detail of this if you leave halfway. And if you refuse to share, at least be honest in the comments and say why you'd rather keep the familiar version than wrestle with the older one. There is another reason these texts are difficult. They do not just enlarge Jesus. They also enlarge the human calling. That is where things become controversial. Because some strands of Ethiopian preserved tradition use language that sounds almost unbearable to institutional religion. Children of light, glory reflected in humanity, the kingdom within. Salvation not merely as legal acquittal, but awakening and restoration to what humanity was made for. Now, this is where people can get careless, so it has to be said correctly. This does not mean human beings become God by nature. It does not erase creator and creature, but it does push hard against a vision of salvation that is only external, only bureaucratic, only mediated through structures that can be managed from above. It insists that Christ came not merely to forgive from a distance, but to restore participation, to heal what was broken in the human being so that communion with God is no longer abstract. And if that message is emphasized strongly enough, people begin to ask dangerous questions. Questions like, how much of the Christian life can be reduced to compliance? How much has been turned into performance? How much fear has been used where awe should have been? How much dependence on human authority has grown where direct obedience to Christ should have been central? That is precisely the kind of pressure a text like Enoch or the Ascension of Isaiah can place on a religious system, not because they remove holiness, but because they put holiness back in direct contact with the reader. And once that happens, control gets harder. Most people imagine resurrection as stillness, a body lying in darkness, a moment of breath returning, a quiet exit from a tomb. The Ethiopian and Enochic imagination pushes you towards something much bigger. Not quiet, violent with glory, not noisy in a human sense, but shattering in a cosmic sense, the source of life entering death and tearing it open from the inside, the hidden one unveiled again. The radiance that had been dimmed in descent beginning to blaze outward in return. And if that is true, then the resurrection is not merely proof that Jesus is alive. It is the reordering of reality around the fact that life is more original than death. That is why miracles in Ethiopian theology can be understood not as violations of nature, but as restoration of nature. Christ does not interrupt reality. He restores it to obedience. The storm does not break the rules when it obeys him. It remembers him. The body does not become unnatural when it is healed. It is brought nearer to its intended order. The grave does not become surreal when it yields him. It is exposed as temporary before the one through whom all things were made. That is a very different scale of storytelling. And it is exactly the kind of scale Gibson's words suggest he is trying to recover. Because if Christ is the Lord of all realms, then his rising cannot be shown merely as one more inspiring comeback. It has to feel like the turning of the axis, the ripping open of the small story, By the larger one, it was always sitting inside. There is a reason this story unsettles modern assumptions. It relocates authority. For a long time, many people in the Western world were taught, directly or indirectly, to imagine Christian intellectual history, flowing mainly from Rome, then Europe, then later America. But Ethiopia has been standing there the whole time, ancient, liturgical, textual, deeply Christian, preserving traditions older than many people realize, and not on the margins. At the center of some of the biggest unanswered questions about early Christianity. What if Africa did not merely receive Christian tradition? What if it helped preserve dimensions of it the West lost? What if some of the most important manuscript traditions for understanding how early believers imagined Christ are still sitting in monasteries most people have never heard named? What if the historical arrogance has been backward this whole time? That is why scholars keep circling these manuscript traditions with increasing seriousness. Not because every claim made around them is correct, not because every dramatic internet summary is trustworthy, but because the manuscript world of Ethiopia is real, old, massive, and not yet fully exhausted by modern scholarship. That means there are still questions here, real questions. Textual questions, historical questions, theological questions, questions about preservation, transmission, canon, influence, and imagination. And those questions do not go away just because a modern audience has never been taught to ask them. Mel Gibson is one of the few directors who could even attempt this, not because he is universally trusted, not because he is uncontroversial, but because he has already shown he will risk scale, money, and reputation to tell a biblical story without softening it for comfort. That matters. Because a sequel built around heavenly descent, angelic rebellion, cosmic resurrection, non-linear spiritual geography, and Christ moving across realms is not a safe studio product. It is a gamble, a massive one. Studios usually want clarity, clean arcs, simple emotional access, minimal theological complexity. This story resists all of that. It asks viewers to think in terms of heaven, time, hierarchy, judgment, concealment, glory, and restoration all at once. That is risky. But it is also exactly the kind of risk that can reshape a genre if it lands. Because religious cinema in the West has often been trapped between two extremes. On one side, sanitized inspiration. On the other, detached spectacle. What Gibson seems to be chasing is something else entirely. A biblical imagination large enough to feel terrifying again. Ancient enough to feel dangerous again. Beautiful enough to feel worth following into the unknown. That is why people are paying attention. Not just because it is a sequel. Because it may be the first time a major film tries to put the cosmic Christ on screen at a scale the modern audience can no longer ignore. And this may be the most haunting part of all. The monks who kept copying these texts were not building a media strategy. They were not trying to win a culture war. They were not preparing a Hollywood rollout. They were copying because they believed the words were sacred. That's it. Think of the patience in that. Stone walls, thin light, cold mornings, hands moving line by line across parchment, generation after generation with no idea what the future would do with what they guarded. They did not know the Western world would forget these texts. They did not know audiences centuries later would be shocked by ideas that were ordinary parts of their devotional world. They simply kept faith with what had been handed down. That is one of the strongest arguments for taking this seriously. Not that every modern claim around Ethiopia is automatically correct, but that preservation like this does not happen by accident. A people do not guard texts across invasions, isolation, dynastic shifts, hardship, and centuries unless they believe what they are carrying matters. And now the modern world is circling back, slowly, uneasily, sometimes carelessly, sometimes sensationally, but circling back all the same. Because once you realize there may be dimensions of early Christian imagination that survived more fully in Ethiopia than in the West, you can't quite go back to thinking the story was settled. At some point, this stops being about one director. It stops being about one movie. It stops even being mainly about one banned book. It becomes about recognition. Recognition that the image many people carry of Jesus may be real in part, but incomplete in scale, too small in majesty, too manageable in tone, too detached from the trembling language of the oldest visions. Because the Christ described in Enoch, echoed in Revelation, mapped in the Ascension of Isaiah, and preserved in Ethiopian devotion is not merely comforting. He is sovereign in a way that stretches the imagination until it breaks. He is gentle without being reduced, merciful without being sentimental, hidden without being absent. He enters as an infant, yet heaven knows who he is. He walks in dust, yet storms obey him. He dies, yet death itself cannot keep hold of what it did not create. He rises, and the event spills beyond the city, beyond the witnesses, beyond the timeline, beyond the visible world. Once you start seeing him like that, some church art begins to feel like a whisper where thunder should have been. Some preaching begins to feel smaller than the text allows. Some assumptions begin to fall apart. And that may be why this story matters so much right now, because a culture that has made Jesus either decorative or merely therapeutic is suddenly at risk of meeting him again as cosmic king. That changes people, sometimes beautifully, sometimes painfully, but never casually. If you made it this far, don't disappear now. Subscribe, because this is the kind of video people leave intending to come back to and almost never do. And if you won't subscribe, go to the comments and say it plainly. Say why you'd rather keep the easier version instead of following the harder question to the end. And here is the question left hanging over all of it. If the Book of Enoch alone was enough to make the Western portrait of Jesus feel incomplete, what is still waiting in the manuscripts that have never been fully translated? What remains in the highlands? What else was copied, guarded, kissed, chanted, carried, and preserved by people the modern world barely bothered to ask? What else did they keep because they never agreed to forget? Because this story may not end with one movie. It may not even end with one rediscovered text. It may be the beginning of a much larger confrontation between the Christianity that was simplified and the Christianity that remained vast. A confrontation between the painted Jesus many people learned to recognize and the cosmic Christ the earliest believers trembled to describe. Mel Gibson may put some of that on screen. Maybe only part of it. Maybe enough to disturb millions. Maybe enough to make people go back and ask better questions than they've ever asked before. But whether Hollywood gets it right or not, one fact remains. In the mountains of Ethiopia, through war, through invasion, through silence, through centuries when the rest of the world looked elsewhere, they kept copying. And if what they preserved is even half as explosive as the fragments already known, then the story most people think they know is not ending. It is only just opening. If this opened your eyes, watch this next video right here. What happens 5 minutes after you die? The Bible reveals the truth. Because what you just learned connects directly to what happens after death. I will link it immediately at the end of this video, and if you are watching from the United States or anywhere else in the world, drop your location in the comments too. See you in the next video. Good night, and God bless you.